if I know all of you probably really enjoyed reading the some 2,000 pages that were put into your binder and are just experts on that. Is there any other data or information that from yesterday or from our last meeting that you thought, I really wish that this was available or that we needed? Just keep that in the back of your mind. Don't hesitate to reach out either right today or via email if there's more information that you guys need, or if we can better point you to existing information. All right, with that, without more ado, I'm going to touch on one thing that I wanted to follow up on from our last meeting from slide 8, which is a discussion about missing middle housing. And Tom in particular had asked me, what do you mean by missing middle housing? I think this is kind of a hot term that is being bandied about in the industry. But really what it is it's just a way to describe a type of housing that has always been built throughout all of human existence in different forms and iterations. But Opticos is actually the ones who coined it. And one of the reasons it's called the missing middle is it's just a housing type product that we don't really produce anymore. Really in the last 70 years, as we've started doing more suburban development, as we've started having, really tight zoning codes and kind of the fairly recent development patterns, that these are the kind of housing types that our financial infrastructure and our zoning regulations and our housing expansion history has not been bringing on the market. So where we see these, a lot of times they either have to be very intentionally built or they're kind of leftover remains from prior development efforts. So though this is a great example of the missing middle, this diagram really shows it's those duplexes, the fourplexes, the courtyard buildings, those cottage courtyards, townhomes, multiplex, triplex, those live work facilities. What we see more and more being produced in the last 20 years and before that, the last 50 years, is really these detached single family houses with pretty large multifamily housing. On the website this is just one diagram, but on the website we put together another packet of materials that deep dives into missing middle housing types for anyone who wants to explore this further. And you can actually dig into what these mean, how we've defined it in Howard County. In Opticos' original discussion, it's not only these housing forms, but also discussion about them being for middle income. Obviously, income is specific to many different areas. Yes, last week we talked about the income levels for Howard County. So that's a part of this definition in the broader discussion, but I think for our purposes in Howard County, we're really focusing on the type. So I just wanted to bring that up for anyone who needed a refresher on what that term means. And then we'll move on to slide 9 for our today's deep dive.
So I'm sorry, you're saying that you're focusing on it as a type, not as a cost.
I think we want to talk about in this work group, how can we provide a range of housing types at a range of price points, but we're not necessarily limiting pricing to this type of housing. Like, we're not saying if you build a triplex, it will only support a family that makes this. We're saying we want a range of different housing types that support people at their cost of theirs. So MITU programs, for instance, you might have a house that might otherwise be unaffordable by type, but because it's subsidized, it becomes affordable to a certain segment of the population, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would just add that I think there's no particular reason to build a certain housing type just because you like the architecture of it. The reason you would build those types is because you could reach a different market segment. So the type itself seems secondary to who you're reaching with it.
I think there's price, but there's also utility. So for instance, cottage courtyards can be a great option for senior population because they tend to be smaller, one story with kind of communal space for them. So that's the type that supports a particular demographic. However, those are actually fairly rare to be constructed, so the price points can be incredibly high because you can basically have bidding wars for that kind of thing. So I think it's a matter of looking at both the type of housing that fits someone's need, how many kids they have, how many bedrooms they need, as well as the income they have to buy that house at the price point they can afford. So I think it's kind of a two-prong is how I would approach it.
But are we also trying to build housing for particular demographics? We have more older adults, or we have more families with children. So as we're looking at land, Are we saying this would be best suited for this type of housing to address this need? Is
Yeah,
that what you're kind of thinking too, or?
I'm thinking it's more about price. And
Okay.
you can build, condo, 1-bedroom apartments where somebody has an elevator, to serve a senior as well. So, maybe we want different types because we think there's a demand for those that the market hasn't met. But to me, a lot of it is about price.
For affordable housing, for sure, and the smaller units, the less the price too, so that would be the advantage of some of these designs, right, in a certain sense.
And more density,
Right.
with cost.
Right, I'm right.
Right, yes.
I guess my point is that we're not building townhouses because we really like the way they look and
Right.
we just.
Right, no,
Right.
exactly, yeah, I understand, that makes sense. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry.
I do want to just note, one of the hurdles with condo developments and using those as affordable housing or missing middle, whatever you want to say, is that the condo fees tend to be a barrier to entry. That's something that we see often in Montgomery County. So I don't know. I assume that they're probably relatively high wherever they're being developed in Howard County, but that's something to keep an eye on.
yeah. So I think I'm gonna save some of our conversation for after our presentation. We have pretty lengthy presentations today, kind of dumping a lot of information on you guys with a little bit of conversation. If we could, so we're gonna move into our next section, which is our distribution of affordable and attainable housing. So, as we talked about last week, general plan, we discussed it, how it lays out policy direction to help guide growth in the county. It articulates an overall vision, how we're going to meet current and future needs of those who live, work, and visit the county. We discussed the demographic characteristics of Howard County, looking at our population and their income, as well as what affordable means. And today we're going to, in addition to discussing our adequate public facilities and the regulatory framework that manages growth, we're going to talk about the high level look at the distribution of affordable housing. If you can stay on this slide, Lisa. In general, taken as a whole, Howard County, we do have a wide range of housing types. We talked about missing middle. We have quite a few examples of missing middle in the Howard County. But a lot of that tends to be older. A lot of our newer single family detached homes are larger, they're more expensive. And those larger homes tend to make up a higher share of available homes that are for sale. So that very much prices people out from being able to move to Howard County. And this slide that we're on right now, it shows where homes are located relative to the age of the housing stock. So as you can see, most attainable housing, attainable is a term that we define in our general plan, is it's really housing that it's not subsidized housing, it's housing that may be more affordable at a market rate because of the type of housing it is. And a lot of that consists of our older housing stock. Our newer homes are more likely to be located in the western portion of Howard County. And in our western portion of Howard County, we do not have water and sewer infrastructure, we're well and septic. And because of past policies for agricultural preservation and where we wanted to grow and how we plan to grow, as well as our policy direction we have in our most recently adopted plan, we're not seeing a major expansion of our public service area. So we're not going to get water and sewer out there. So we do have limitations from a physical sense of the type of housing and how much density we can put into the west. So that all of these past growth, historical growth patterns, as well as our policy changes, means that we're going to continue to kind of have a little bit of an east to west divide in terms of housing product and density and options in our west and our eastern areas. We can go to the slide, the next slide, where we talk about rental housing. Now, all of these slides that you're seeing are really, Lisa, if you can go back one. Is it jumping?
It is. Hang on a second.
Thanks. We're having some technical.
This one, or you want the one?
The previous one.
This.
Yes. So these are really from 2019. And if you kind of want to look at updates to these, we have included those in your packets. Both the most recent 2024 rental housing survey, as well as the housing sales report. But it shows a really good overview in general, looking at the kind of rental housing stock that we have in Howard County as well, where a lot of our the majority of our rental housing stock is these older garden style apartments and townhomes. And our newer stock, we're starting to see those wraparound podium apartments, as well as some like specific niche developments for our active adult seniors. So we're going to continue seeing that kind of like difference in our age of our different housing stock. And those surveys have a really good review of what is available, what's on the market, and the fact that prices are increasing across all different housing types. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is talking a little bit about showing it in a different way. So you can actually see, so this was from 2019, but you could actually see what was available for rent and what was available for sale. And, you know, the vast majority of what's available in Howard County is these single-family detached homes. And on the bottom of the chart, you can kind of see the proportion of what was available over time. So anyone who's trying to move within Howard County, they are already here, or anyone who's trying to move into Howard County is kind of contending with this market where there's overall just less available on the market for them to look to buy, and that they're kind of having to buy something that is available. So if you are someone who, I don't want to be in a single family detached home, nor can I afford a single detached home, you're probably just not being able to move here, is one of the conditions that we're finding. And some people might be buying housing types that they don't particularly want for themselves because they can't find a different housing type they want. Let's go to the next slide.
I'm sorry, just in this slide, is that the actual inventory of what the county owns, or is this somehow what was actually on the market? Or is this just the total housing inventory?
So I think in 2019, I think that, Kelly,
No, I think it was the housing
I think it was
inventory.
the housing, yeah.
I think it's what was here
So
at
the
that
county
time.
is 50% single family detached.
Yes,
Okay.
based on what that is, yes,
Yeah, okay.
I believe that's correct.
She ready?
All right, and then this is another distribution of our housing inventory in 2019. And you can see this is actually kind of a breakdown more of the submarkets. So this is talking a little bit about trying to find a housing type that you want in your price point in a particular area within Howard County. In that rural west, which makes up, you know, I think more a larger percentage of the whole area of the county, it's very difficult to find any kind of housing type that's not a single family detached. And as I said earlier, a lot of what has been built out there in the last 20 to 40 years tends to be larger and more expensive. So we can go to the next slide. And this is a really good map for looking at the kind of uneven home ownership rates. So part of the issue with the housing product and where it gets built is that certain kinds of housing product are more likely to be rentals than home ownership. So you have limited home ownership opportunities in certain areas of the county. And it as we know, that can act as a stepping stone a lot of times in that wealth generation to be able to move from rental to home ownership. It's not the only way to build wealth in America, but it is certainly one of the major ones that a lot of past federal state policies support. So that's a condition that we face in the county. We can go to the next slide. And so this is some more recent, these are taken from the housing sales report. We have the one from 2022 and the one from 2023 just came out. You know, this is just a snapshot in time of the last year, but I think you can see how prices are continuing to increase and where they're most likely to decrease, or whereas they're a little bit more stable on the eastern side. And I'm going to defer to Jeff Bronow, as he's the one that produces the report on any detailed questions of it. But I think one of the major highlights that we see there is Columbia in particular, and a lot of the eastern side of Howard County has a significantly higher diversity of housing type. And that diversity of housing type actually kind of helps keep prices down a little bit more. So it helps with the competition aspect of things. So we can go to the next slide.
Hey, I'm sorry, is that constant dollar?
No. So this, no, it's not constant dollars. It's real, it's actual dollars for each year. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean,
So this,
you'd have changes, if housing prices hadn't changed at all, it would look different with a 5% inflation rate.
Right.
In those two slides anyway,
Yeah.
okay.
And this is year to year, looking at prices, and as we pointed out, it's not controlled for anything.
So in 13 and 14 periods, there was no change in single family, 0.
in terms of price change, correct?
Price change,
Yep, yep,
2013 to
Yeah.
2015,
yeah,
there was no change in price.
Yeah. for the median, yeah.
And I think, Jeff and I were chatting about this a few days ago, and I think one of the interesting things that came out of this is actually kind of see this little spike in condo prices going up recently, which is a little bit bucking the trend of the past. So,
And the really interesting thing about, so I don't know if this whole report, it's not a very long report, it's only 4 pages or something, but it's on our website. There's another chart that shows the number of housing sales each year. And the number of housing sales between 2022 and 23 was reduced dramatically.
Yes.
It was really quite astounding. It was like
No, I,
30%.
So astounding that we're going to look at it next.
Oh, you have it?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm sorry. All right. Sorry about that.
No, you're good.
In the report, it's flipped. That's first and this is second.
I
Okay.
try very hard to keep things a little more. Yeah, so this is looking at the total, so these are the total number of housing unit sales. And the reason it's important to look not just at the housing price, but actually the number of units of sales, you can actually see that the number of units that were sold are decreasing. So one of that, puts that upward pressure on the price in a significant way. I think what I see when I look at this is the fact that it might be interest rates. It might not be that you can't find a different housing type you need. It might not be able to find a housing type you need at a price you can afford. But we have a lot of people who are just sitting in their homes. So the homes are not coming on the market. And when they do come on the market, they are competing for a lot of high demand. And so the price is increasing as well. So that's a pretty big drop. I think we all kind of know that the pandemic spurred a little bit of a kind of a run on housing where there were a lot of people who were trying to move as a result of that. I think we saw that spike in 2021. And I guess we'll look at the continuing trends to see if this is going to keep happening, but it's a pretty significant drop.
I'll just know that you don't know the cause and effect. You don't know if there aren't housing units on the market or if people just can't buy. So that would be a different statistic from this. You might know it from something else.
I think they're being snapped up like that. I think it's because there's not many in the market. And I think it's primarily because of people are locked into really low interest rates, 2, 3, 4%. And now, and now the interest rates are
Right.
7%, 6%, 7%. So until that, the question is, when are people going to choose to move out of their house with a 3% mortgage rate?
well, also, again,
Yeah.
I'm a little surprised with single family attached because what we're seeing is townhomes are being built. If anything's being built, new construction, it's townhomes.
Right.
So I'm a little surprised that's as low as it is because the townhomes are selling immediately.
Right.
Within 120 days of being completed, they have a buyer and the day it's finished, the
Yeah.
buyer moves in.
Yeah.
So I'm a little surprised at the single family attached.
Well, is this resales or all sales?
It's all sales.
So they should be in there.
They-
So they are in there.
Right.
So
It's not enough to overcome
The deficit of the
Yeah.
resales.
there are a lot of people, so there's, like, for example, there was about 1,000 permitted units
Correct,
total.
correct,
Townhomes and single family detached were a portion of those.
correct.
So let's say there was 300 townhomes permitted, then that would be included in that, plus the additional resales. It's not really the resales that aren't.
The resales are not moving, but I also think, as Jessica was saying, if you're in a condo and you want to move to a townhome or a single family, there isn't anything to move to so you're stuck in your condo until there's something for you to move to.
Right, yes, yeah.
So it's the interest rates, but also there's not another housing type
If
that
you're
you
gonna
can
downsize or whatever.
downsize or upsize.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, if you go the other way,
Yeah.
it doesn't work either.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's kind of a little bit of what the market conditions are.
Right.
For the distribution of housing and kind of putting some numbers to people's understanding of Howard County. And then if we go to the next slide, also for this benefit greatly from Kelly being a part of this group is, and I know this map is hard to read on this slide, this is part of your packets. If you want to dig in, these are the maps of where our moderate income housing units, both our rental and our home ownership are throughout the county. You can see a little bit of the concentrations of those. I didn't put a slide to it, but I know one of the discussions that happens around the moderate income housing unit is both the policies of where they're required to be built, but then also just the financial realities of when you're doing, you know, fair large homes with only a few lots, you know, having one of those units or that the numbers don't really work out to provide a lot of those housing types when you're having the larger lot developments out in the west. So we really don't have them located there. Instead, I think we have different fee and lieu programs and things like that to try to capture it. But it does mean that we end up with these units being located primarily on the eastern side of Howard County.
But we have expanded. We have gotten a lot more, you know, Turf Valley area, up more Ellicott City. And we have a community in Marriottsville. So we have expanded more. What for me is the fee and lieu is what's kind of counterproductive. If we could get more age restricted condos, apartments, townhomes, that would really improve the map. But and you pay fee and lieu. That would,
How many of them are there total? How many are we talking about MIHU?
You can pull the number.
communities or numbers of units.
Number of units?
Rental is well over 1,000. I don't know the exact number. I have to go back and look at my thing. It's well over 1,000. And I want to say that for sales is around 500. Approximate, but we do have the exact numbers.
And just a reminder, what we will do at the staff will go back and when we write up a summary and kind of just provide the bullet point summary of the discussion, we'll also try to answer these questions and do that in our summaries. If we don't have it ready to go, we'll get that to you. And if we go to the next slide, I think I am finished up on our very high level overview of, you know, housing distribution in the county. And I'm going to ask Jeff to step on the plate, and he's going to provide our presentation on the adequate public facilities ordinance and its role.
Okay, thank you, Jess. So I know people in this room are very familiar with the APFO. The people online, are you familiar with APFO? I know that's a very general question, but I
Yes.
want to,
Yes.
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 Good. And meaning knowing how it works, et cetera. Well, anyways, so this presentation, I'll try to be relatively quick. There's a lot of slides in it. It's almost the same presentation that was given to the APFO task force that is currently meeting as well. So if you want to watch that as well, I believe it was videotaped. And we had given an overview to that group as well to kind of talk about the history of APFO and how it works. And so this is a shorter version of that. So feel free to ask questions and if you, in the middle of the presentation as I go along. APFO first began in 1992 after the 1990 general plan. So it's been in effect for a long time now. And the committee back then decided that they wanted to institute growth controls, which is the adequate public facilities ordinance, and also institute a road excise tax at the same time. A school excise tax was also discussed at the time, but it was decided not to implement that. It was just the road excise tax, which is a tax on new construction, both residential and non-residential, on a per square foot basis of the construction size to pay for the expansions of roads in Howard County. Major expansions like the widening of Route 29 or adding interchanges. For example, the 216-29 interchange, those weren't in existence back then. So the county needed a fair amount of revenues to be able to finance bonds to construct major infrastructure projects. So that was implemented back then, although there was a school excise tax added more recently, beginning in fiscal year 2005, $1 a square foot for residential only. And then it was increased to about $8 a square foot phased in over 3 years, beginning in FY 2021. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a history of building permits since 1979. So you can see here in the 80s, there's a lot of construction in Howard County, an average of about 3,078 units per year. And so that was the time of the 1990 general plan. There was a lot of growth in Howard County, and it was decided that the county needed an APFO to manage this growth, because at the time, the infrastructure really wasn't keeping up. There was a lot of school overcrowding at the time, and there wasn't the budget to build new schools, et cetera. So the 1990 general plan called for an APFO, and then that legislation was adopted in 1992. And part of that legislation basically mandated only so many units could be built in the county per year. And that's what's considered allocations, which I'll talk about in a minute. So you can see after APFO was implemented in the 2000s, the number of units built per year was reduced to about 2,000 units per year. So it worked. It managed growth. It paused growth. It limited so many units to be built per year. And then every 10 years or so, the county adopts a new general plan. And so when the 2000 general plan was adopted in 2000, the decision was to even slow the growth more to about 1,500 units per year. So you see that in the decade of 2000s. And then the 2000 Plan Howard 2030, which was adopted in 2012, kept about the same place. So for over the last 20 years or so, the county's built about 1,500 units per year, managed by the APFO. Next slide, please. So there's 3 tests associated with APFO. There's the allocations test, which is basically an allocation equals a housing unit. Then there's a schools test. If the schools are overcrowded in the area where a project is to be built, and that project is put on hold until the capacity for the school is available. And then the third test is the roads test. And that test doesn't stop growth, but it basically requires a developer to do a transportation study and to mitigate any road impacts. So the developer, for example, will build a right turn lane or a signalized intersection to try to mitigate any kind of road impacts from the new growth. The allocations test is conducted at the initial plan stage. So right when a subdivision plan comes into the county, at the sketch plan stage, that's when the test is taken. And it typically takes about 3 years from sketch plan to building the units. And so the allocations are granted if the allocations are available. And then 3 years later, the units would show up on the ground and people will be living in those units. If there's no allocations available, then the project's placed on hold until allocations become available the following year. And then the school capacity utilization test is conducted once the project receives allocations. So the order is important. So the allocations, first the project needs allocations. If they're available, they get them, and then they take the schools test. If the schools are open, they can proceed. If not, they can be held up for up to 4 years. And then I talked about the roads test earlier. The traffic study is conducted, et cetera. The next slide, please. So I think I mentioned most of this. An allocation basically means a housing unit. So it's one dwelling unit, and it doesn't matter the type of unit. It could be a single family detached, it could be a single family attached or townhouse, or an apartment, which is a rental apartment or a condo apartment. That's one unit equals one allocation. And the intent of the allocations is to pace development so that the county government can plan and provide for capital facilities. And then each year, the county council, typically in July, adopts a new 10-year allocation chart, which is based on the general plan growth chart, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the allocations is really dictated by the general plans that are adopted every 10 years. And the allocations are given out by geographic or other specialty pools, as indicated in the general plan allocation chart. And there's also some exemptions possible, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this, allocations are given out upon initial plan approval. And so the chart is always 3 years in the future. So the chart that was just adopted last July, in July 2024, the first year is 2027, because of the way it works is a subdivision would come in, and typically, on average, about 3 years later, those units would be built. And the allocations can be phased. If it's, for example, a 500-unit subdivision, then it could be phased over 5 years and receive an allocation for each of the next 5 years, 100 units, for example. If there's not enough allocations available in the current year, then they would take what's remaining and then what we call force phase into the future. So it limits how much could be built in Howard County each year. And the projects must continue to go through the submission process, from like a sketch plan to a preliminary plan, to a final plan, to a site development plan, to meet milestone dates. As long as they meet those milestone dates, they can keep their allocations until the units are actually built and people move in. If milestone dates are missed, then the plans become voided. And that's really the intention of that, is to make sure that allocations are available for another project that is moving forward. So they're kind of put back in the pool once the allocations are voided. Once allocations are taken for an area in the county each year, once the limit is reached, then they go into a waiting bin. So for example, if there's, in the early years of APFO, there might have been 150 allocations available per year in Oak Ridge. So once those 150 allocations were taken from projects in Oak Ridge that year, any further project that came in, they would be placed in a waiting bin on a first come, first served basis. And then the next year, when the county council was up to the next chart and another 150 allocations were available in Oak Ridge, then that project first in line would be able to get the allocation. So again, it's a way to pace growth and phase growth over time. Next, please. So I mentioned that the allocations are based on the general plans. And so there's been 4 general plans since APFO was adopted in 1992, including the 1990 general plan. So you have the 1990 general plan, then the 2000 general plan, and then the Plan Howard 2030, which was adopted in 2012. And then just recently is HOCO by design. So this chart is in the latest general plan, HOCO by design, and it's the allocation chart that dictates these annual charts that the county council adopts each year. And so the current geographic regions, as you can see, are listed there. There's the downtown Columbia region, which are allocations dedicated just to the downtown Columbia plan. And then there's activity center allocations, other character area allocations, the rural west allocations, which is the area, west of the planned service area that Jess mentioned earlier. And then you have the total. And then the new thing in the HOCO by design is this affordable housing set aside. And one of the tasks of this work group is to come up with a way to utilize those allocations as a way to incentivize affordable housing. So it's sort of a special incentivizing pool for affordable housing units that could take advantage of those 340 units per year. The next,
I'm sorry, just so I understand, does that mean that it could be possible to build 1,740 units in the county, or is the 340 a subset of the 1,400 or an add-on to the 1,400?
it's a add-on.
So you could
Good
build,
question. Yes.
if you had 1,400 market rate units, you could build another 340 affordable units.
Exactly.
But if you don't build any in the rural west, you can't take that 100 and put it somewhere else.
No, you can't. Exactly. You can't.
Okay.
Right. Yep.
You can't put it, okay.
I would also say that the columns to the left are geographic. They're limited to those geographic areas, whereas the rural housing is not geographically limited.
Okay, so the affordable housing can be anywhere,
Exactly. Yeah.
but the other allocations are for those
Right.
areas.
Right.
Okay.
And now that we're talking about affordable housing, this is important. So moderate income housing units, MIHUs, as part of zoning, don't require allocations.
Correct,
And that was new. That was new from the 2019 task force, or
correct.
the 2015 task force adopted in 2019. I think it's important for this group to know. So right now, any moderate income housing unit does not need an allocation. So for example, let's say it's a 150 unit apartment building, 10% has to be MIHUs for the zoning. So those 15 MIHU units do not need allocations. So this affordable housing pool on the right really is anything in addition to the MIHU zoning that we currently have. And it could be something like density bonus or zoning overlay and the various things that Jessica had mentioned.
So if in downtown I were to get 10% example, there would be 22 MIHUs example. There could still be an additional affordable housing component from the last column.
There could be, exactly, yeah.
Okay.
And that's why it was put there intentionally by design, right, to try to incentivize affordable housing even more than we already try to do with MIHUs. So this map also comes from HOCO by design. The colors of this map replicate the colors in the chart. So this is the geography of the numbers distribution. So basically the green on the left, on the west, that's the 100 per year in the rural west coming out of that green area. The blue color is the other character areas. So the numbers in the chart and the other character areas can be built anywhere in that area. The yellow sort of color is the activity center pool. That includes Columbia Gateway and the village centers. You see all those dots. Areas along the corridor, the Route 40 corridor. Was there a question? Okay. And then downtown Columbia is the red in the middle. That's the pool that matches the downtown Columbia plan.
So I don't have the numbers in front of you,
You can
but
go
just
back.
thinking back, so that red, the downtown Columbia is maybe a third or more of all of the housing units?
You might go on the other way.
Go back
Yeah,
on.
yeah.
And the chart was revised to reflect, what has already been delivered in downtown Columbia, because
All right, so-
downtown Columbia plan had a set number of total units that were allowed to be built under it. So
Right,
the chart reflects.
right. So it's not a third. It was much less.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
if you go-
Not-
if you
it's
go
more like
back-
a sixth or something. Or
Yeah,
a
if you go
fifth,
back,
yeah.
we'll take a look and see.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, Jeff, I think for the gateway, which is
Mhm.
currently undergoing a master plan zone, there might be additional units that are allocated to.
Yes, right. So there's some discussion in HOCO by design. We didn't want to presuppose what the Gateway Master Plan would yield. So the intention is once the Gateway Master Plan is completed, the allocation chart in HOCO by design could be amended to include
Mhm.
Gateway.
Mhm.
Okay.
There it is.
Oh,
It's like freezing and then moving.
all right, okay.
It's fine.
All right.
Keep going.
Go back in. This is really, I don't want to go into this in detail, but it's really to show that there's been a fair amount of changes over time with the allocations. And it's been a long time, right, since 1992. So there's, with each general plan, there's a different geographic area and there's a different chart and a different map. So I don't have all the maps. I wanted to kind of limit this presentation, but if you do look at the APFO presentation, it goes into the details of all the different types of maps of all the old general plans, but it's the past. So it's really a done deal at this point. It doesn't really matter unless you're interested in the history of APFO. But the point is that there's been changes over time that adapt to policy that the decision makers, the elected officials, have decided to make over the last 40 plus years. Next slide, please. And what this shows, this chart is sort of a summary of the history of APFO. So the first year in the chart in the upper left is 1995, and that was the first year of APFO in the allocation chart. The APFO was adopted in 1992. So the first allocation year was 3 years ahead because the concept of it takes 3 years to design, plan, and build units. And what the columns on the right show are each general plan. So there's 4 sections there. So the very top section is the 1990 general plan. And at the time, the geographic areas were these 6 school districts. So they align with the school districts: Columbia East, Columbia West, North, Northeast, Southeast, and the West. And what it shows for each year is if a certain geographic area was closed at some point before the end of the annual allocation year. So in the 1996 allocation year, you can see that two areas were closed to development, the north and the northeast, meaning that more subdivision plans came in than there were units available to allocate to them. So those subdivisions were placed in a waiting bin until next year. So you can see how it managed growth or slow growth in these areas in the north and the northeast when demand for housing and construction of housing was going strong.
Cedric has a question.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You can unmute yourself, Cedric.
Thank you, Lisa.
We can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm trying. Can you hear me now?
There you go.
You're good.
Yeah, regarding the APFO, I just wanted you to go into a little description of the roads component. And I would assume that what the focus is not to overcrowd the streets and the roads and look at the traffic count. And my question is, are we now able to look at the traffic count? And given that people are, partly doing telecommuting, and the average person is probably going in 2 or 3 days a week, is it safe to say now that traffic count is a little lower than it was 10, 15 years ago? And would that open up more flexibility for allowing more units?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. But we can look into that. If traffic is less because of the telecommuting increase, I definitely know it was less around the time that this started with COVID, but I think it's come back. But we could look into that to find that out.
Yeah,
Right.
we can look into the historical of what the recent has been coming in, because it's during the test being taken, that's when you actually do the counts.
Right.
And so we can look at what our most recent counts have been showing. The other aspect of this is the Howard County recently adopted a complete street policy. They've updated their design manuals. Part of that discussion was the consideration of just pedestrians and bicyclists and other users of the streets. So there's been a lot of discussion in the county of how best to ensure that we're not overbuilding our intersections to the detriment of other users as a result of trying to meet our traffic needs. And so
Right.
that's also a factor that's being considered by the AFA task force.
Yeah. Yeah, so Jess mentioned the AFO task force. So just the last AFO task force meeting last week, 2 weeks ago, there was a very good discussion and presentation of how the APFO roads test works. That if you're interested, it might be helpful to watch that video.
Okay.
It's on our website. Yeah.
And we'll show we'll share all these direct links with you guys. I don't want you to have to hunt around on the websites. So we'll get that information to you.
Okay. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you. Sure.
Do you mind just going back really quick? So I mentioned the first sort of block there. The second block is after the 2000 general plan was adopted, and you can see a lot more areas were added, particularly over time when new policies were added. And you can see the closures were a little bit more extensive also during the 2000s. And then with Plan Howard 2030, a different sort of policy dynamic was created, aligned with some state planning laws that created different geographies like established communities, growth and revitalization, et cetera. And so you can see what was closed there. Now, the important thing, and then the very last one, where we have 1 year's experience with HOCO by design, and you can see the activity centers, other character areas at the bottom of the chart that we talked about previously. The important thing to see on this chart, though, however, allocations haven't held up growth for about 10 years. So, and that's really because growth has been slowing in the county, primarily because land has become more limited. We're running out of land in Howard County. So one question that the APFO committee is going to consider is, are allocations necessary anymore? The concept of allocations. We can still keep the schools test, but are allocations necessary if growth has been slowing?
No, let's do it the other way around.
Yeah.
Keep the
okay.
allocations
Okay.
status,
Yeah, there you go. Okay, right.
drop AFO.
But they're considering, right, yeah. So it's been a long time, and is APFO working, right? So,
Yes.
it's a question, so, yeah, right. I don't know if they're considering that one.
No, I'm sure they're not.
Right.
But I think the thing is, it's working as designed, but there is some unintended consequences and value trade-offs to be
Yes.
reconsidered.
Well, I think Paul will be the first to say our allocations haven't been used up in years.
Yeah, right,
We have not
yeah,
we've had many unused allocations. Nobody's in the waiting bin anymore for allocations.
right, exactly.
And most of us pass the traffic tests with ease.
Mhm.
Right.
So the only real control in that right now is schools.
Mhm. And HOCO by design actually has a policy to consider the allocations test. I would say it's worked well since the nineties because it has slow growth in areas that, and the other thing you might the intention of allocations is really not the slow growth for schools only, it's the slow growth for all infrastructure in the county.
Correct.
The police and fire and parks and rec to kind of catch up to, because we were at 3,000 units a year in the eighties. So we split it down to 2,000, 1,500. And now growth is sort of naturally slowing anyway. So the question is, are allocations necessary? So,
Because since 2020, everything's open. So for 4 years, this hasn't been anything that's
even,
determined if infrastructure is
yeah,
necessary, if changes are needed.
exactly. It's even longer because the 2020 is 3 years ahead.
Okay, right.
So it's like, it's 2020, because right now we're in the 2027 allocation year.
Correct.
Yeah, right. So it's been like 9 years, something like that, right? Yeah, so. Yeah, so it's a question. Okay, next slide, please. And this is really just to show, what I just mentioned, that this is the number of allocations granted, actually granted, not available, but granted since fiscal year 2007, which was allocation year 2010. And you can see the number of allocations, from 2010 through 20, it's around that 1,500 average number I mentioned before. But then since 2020, growth has been slowing, and the number of allocations given out has been slowing as well. Separated out downtown Columbia from the rest of Howard County, because downtown Columbia has a fair amount of development relative to the county, and also it has its own plan and its sort of own designated pool of allocations.
But it is also safe to say, everyone who requested an allocation got one.
Yes, yeah, everyone request one got one, yeah, because the numbers are relatively low relative to what's allowed in the general plan. Yeah, exactly right. Okay, next, please. So that's allocations test. And then, so once the project has its allocations, which the last 7 years hasn't been a problem, then the project takes what's called the schools test. And there's 4 subtests of the schools tests. So those 4 areas have to be all under the capacity utilization as designed by APFO. So there's an elementary school district test, middle school district test, and high school district test. And there's also an elementary school region test. And a region is an aggregation of elementary districts that are all contiguous next to each other. There's something like 40 plus elementary school districts in the county. So there's that many elementary schools. And I think there's 6 or 7 regions. So it's an aggregation of contiguous 7 or 9 regions connected to each other. And the project must pass all 4 tests at the same time. And if they don't pass all 4 tests, then they go into the waiting bin. So they could pass 3 of the tests, but fail, for example, the middle school test, they still go in the waiting bin. And they can be held up to a maximum of 4 years. It's 5 tests, which can be a maximum of 4 years being held up. And all the 4 tests have to be taken each year. So let's say they pass the 3 tests, but fail the middle school test the first year, and then the next year they fail the high school test, they're still on hold. So they have to pass all 4 at the same time to get out. And then each year, the county council, at the same time they adopt a new allocation chart, they also adopt a new school capacity chart. And that chart shows which schools are open and which schools are closed. We get that chart from the Howard County Board of Education. So the school system comes up with their own projections and their own capacity utilization chart and forwards it to the county, and the county council then reviews it, and then they adopt it as a resolution.
Jacqueline has a question.
Yes.
Thank you. So quick question, if they have to meet if they're in the holding bin, and each year they have to meet the threshold of the four measuring districts, does the 4-year wait restart each year if they're unable to meet one of those criteria for, let's say it's elementary school the first year and then the middle school is the second year, does that 4-year clock start over?
No, so if there's any kind of change or alternation between open or closed schools, it doesn't start over. So they basically, let's say they fail in any way, number of ways for the 5 tests. When they take the 5th test, and if they fail, they get to go forward no matter what.
Keeping in mind that
Interesting.
the idea of this is, it's supposed to give the county and the school board an opportunity to catch up with investing in the infrastructure, knowing that a project is coming online. So it's about slowing growth so that you can pace that kind of investment. So that, and that a lot of the state and federal laws kind of dictate how much you can hold a developer up while you're doing that activity.
Yeah, so the 4 years really is, somebody has the right to develop the property. You can't hold them up indefinitely.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, there's been court cases that have said what's reasonable, what's not reasonable. And Howard County has chosen the maximum of 4 years. Other counties have 7 years, Anne Arundel County. And that was debated actually with the last APFO task force in 2015 to extend it. I think there were some attempts to make it longer, but it has always been 4 years in the history of APFL. Next slide, please. So this is always a fun chart. One of those eye tests.
I failed. I can't see.
I know, so really, this basically lists all of the elementary schools on the left in the county. And all of the years of APFO since the beginning of APFO, starting in 1995. And it's the history of the adoption, history of all the charts. So a C means if it was closed or not for that year. There's some blanks because the schools weren't even built yet, right? So then they start being built and they start filling into the chart. You'll see at the very top in the percentages. So when APFO first started, the capacity utilization for elementary was 120% capacity of local rated capacity. And then APFO was amended in 2023 to reduce it to 115% for elementary schools. And then it was changed in 2022, and this is the 2022 APFO year, so it was back in 2019 when the law became effective, to lower the capacity utilization when elementary schools are closed to 105%. And you can see when that happened, the number of schools that became closed increased significantly. So basically, the schools test was made more strict and more school districts were closed to development. And that could be, and very well is probably another reason that housing has slowed in the more recent times in Howard County. Not only is there, less land availability, so there's less opportunity for new construction, but there's also been projects on hold, more projects on hold because of the stricter schools test. And some developers may choose not to want to even wait to develop because of the more strict, they want to wait for 4 years. So that could also be a reason why housing has been slowing in Howard County. The latest year, the number of elementary schools closed is that 16 or 18? You can see that 2027.
18.
18, thank you.
Out of how many?
Out of, I think, 40 something.
Okay,
I don't
40, so almost,
Yeah,
almost half.
and then, next slide, please. The next two charts are the same exact thing, but for middle schools and high schools. That's the middle school chart at the top and the high school at the bottom. High school test didn't start until 2022. So the last APFO task force recommended, by the way, so the APFO task force did not recommend 105% for elementary schools. The task force recommended 110%. But the county council adopted 105%. But that's when it happened in 2019. And at the same time, the high school test was added in 2019, which is 2022 APFO year, at 115%. And you can see high schools had a number of closures for the last several years until Guilford Park High School was just built and opened up in 2026. And that resolved the problem. So high schools are no longer closed because we have a 14th high school. Or is it 13th? 13th, yes, 13th. Okay.
For the 14th.
Yeah, that's right. And the middle schools, you can see the number at the top there. Middle schools was reduced from 115% to 110% at the same time. And a few more closures happened because of that. Okay, next slide, please. This is the current map of school districts, elementary and middle school and high schools overlaid. Well, no high school, so there's no high school closures, but this shows the number of closed elementary schools and middle schools, the geography that covers in the county. Next slide, please. And this is the last sort of summary chart of all of the history of APFO. This really shows the number of units that have been impacted by allocations on the left side of the chart. The years are listed on the far left, and then the next column over is the number of allocations the number of units that have been held up because they didn't have allocations for each of the years. And then you can see at the bottom of that column that there's no units there, which we talked about earlier because allocations haven't been an issue. And then the second line over is the number of units held up because of schools closures, and then the total. And then do you mind pushing one button forward? There's a little thing that pops up. So this is interesting. So I just did this recently. So if you add up all those units, 24,000 or so, and compare that against the total units built in the county since APFO began of close to 48,000, about 51% of housing units were managed or slowed down because of APFO. So it has been effective. It has slowed growth as intended earlier, and it actually has allowed the county, it has allowed the county to be able to fund and plan and construct new schools and other infrastructure as the growth pace was known through the history. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Yeah.
The network has slowed
Oh,
down,
right,
it's
okay.
shooting me an error.
That's glad it's still working. There are exemptions in the APFO law. In the rural west, if you build a single lot in addition to your current lot, if you want to subdivide your lot in half, for example, and build another house, there's a single lot exemption. There's a single lot for a family member. So if you're going to convey a lot to a family member, there's an exemption. And also for financial hardship. Mobile home replacement units. So if a mobile home park is converted to apartments, for example, which has happened, not recently, but it has happened in the past, then they're not subject to APFO. It's a 1-for-1 replacement. There's some exemptions for redevelopment sites replacing existing units. So if you have an older apartment building with, let's say it's a smaller 20-unit apartment building, and you replace that, redevelop it for 1-for-1, you don't need to retake the schools test. You get a 20-unit credit, basically. There's no school capacity test for age-restricted units, which makes sense because they don't generate school children. And as I mentioned before, moderate income housing units do not need allocations. However, they still must pass the school capacity test. There is a special affordable housing opportunities exemption that was also recently adopted by the county council. And that test, that exemption exempts from both the allocations test and the schools test. And the next slide really shows what that is, because that's been used recently. And it was added with the last APFO task force. And that basically allows, for the next.
Jacqueline has a question.
Oh, yes, Jacqueline?
Just a quick question. How many units have been generated with the exemption for the single lot exemption for rural west or the single lot for family members? Has that generated any additional units?
Yeah, the rural west, we probably get like, lately it's probably 1 or 2 a year, not very many. In the past, it was probably more than that, like a handful a year. As far as the family member, I would say just 1 or 2 a year. So it basically is utilized, but not extensively.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And this is that special affordable housing opportunities. This is the legislation. I won't go through it all, but it basically allows the county council and the county executive to approve either a payment in lieu of taxes agreement. If I hit that one more time, it's kind of thank you. Fancy, huh? There's so much text. A pilot agreement for a project, and the county or the county council passes a resolution authorizing the project to proceed. So it's basically the developer applies for it, and the county has to do some analysis on it to see what impact it would have to schools. And then the Department of Housing also does some analysis as well. So it's quite extensive. A lot of data is gathered and analysis. This is presented to the county council, and then the county council can make the decision if they want to exempt these projects from APFO. And there's been 4 cases that have used this, and that's the next slide, in recent years. I would say the last four years or so. And these are, I guess, 3. They're listed here. Roslyn Rise, 50. Is there 4? Okay. What was the 4th?
Is waivers raised.
Oh, wait, yeah, so I looked at that, but that technically, that didn't have any school closures.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we started working on it. Yeah,
Okay.
so,
Okay.
When they,
so these are projects in Columbia that are redeveloped. And so, they were in school districts that were, closed because of capacity utilization. So analysis was developed and presented to the county council, and ultimately the county council adopted a resolution to exempt these units. So they did not have to pass APFO. And that's the trade-off. That's sort of the dynamic between, nobody wants crowded schools, but we also have a need for affordable housing. And so that's the debate, right? That's the trade-off. And so this exemption has been used to provide for more affordable housing in Howard County. Next, please. And this is really, I mentioned moderate income housing units do not need allocations. We put together a development monitoring system report every year, and that's on our website. These charts come from that. And what this is showing is we really have a fair amount of MIHUs in the pipeline. So the top chart shows what's in the pipeline in terms of what DPZ is reviewing, the total numbers of units. And MIHUs are now required in pretty much all zones in Howard County. So that I forget when that actually happened, but over time it's been expanded. So now I think it can be considered Howard County is full inclusionary zoning now, where pretty much every zoning category, not all, but most, I would say 95% of them, require a certain percentage of affordable housing to be built as part of a development between 10 and 20%. And so you can see that there's more than 600 MIHUs that will be built in the future once these plans get approved. The bottom chart shows the number that were approved in 2023. So a total of 232 MIH units were approved in SDPs. And once they get built, they'll be added to the MIHU inventory. So the county is building affordable housing. But of course, there needs to be more affordable housing. Yeah, so. Next slide, please. This is just a summary, so APFO has worked to slow growth in areas with high development activity. The intent is to allow for new infrastructure to be planned and paid for and built with a known 10-year growth pace. The general plan has defines the growth over 20 years actually, but the chart itself is a 10-year chart that gets adopted by the county council annually. So capital budgeting can be planned because you kind of know the pace of growth. And it's granted relief and given the school system time to plan, redistrict, or build new schools. There's been 30 new schools built since 1992 when APFO began. A lot of schools have been built as the county has grown. And the pacing of growth has also allowed the plan, to plan for these other things in the county: infrastructure, water, sewer, public safety, parks and recreation, community services. So it's not just schools, the pacing of growth with allocations, even though they're not being utilized now, as we discussed, because growth is slowing, it has been effective back in the 90s and the 2000s and even the 2010s. And of course, the trade-off is, APFO does manage the growth. However, since we have a strong housing demand, it limits development. And so therefore that plays a factor in affordable housing. Please. And then I mentioned earlier that the task force is meeting now. And so that I will provide links to the different discussions that are happening. And you can see what they're tasked to do. They're tasked to, similar to this group, there's policies within HOCO by Design that references APFO and what that task force is intended to do. They are looking at school adequacy, and a recent student yield study was completed and presented last time, or two times ago. And that might be something interesting that this group may want to look at. I know Paul has seen
Love
it.
it, recommend it, read it 3 times.
Basically shows the history of student yields, and student yields are actually becoming less in many instances. For example, the new types of apartment units that are being built in downtown Columbia. So this group wants to look at that, and maybe Howard County needs to adjust the school test, for example, and maybe not be so strict for new apartment buildings because the student yields from the new types of apartments are less than they were in the past. Those kinds of questions. Right.
Perfect handoff. As just a reminder that your recommendations that come out of this meeting will feed directly into the APFO task force work. So you're kind of our specialists on the affordable housing issue, but obviously everything works in concert. So we wanted to make sure that your recommendations and your discussions feed into their ultimate recommendations to the county council and the county executive. I know that you guys have been sitting for an hour and a half now, having people talk at you. I'm going to breeze through the next one. We have a lot of meat to throw at you today, and then we'll open it up for discussion and then feed into the next meeting for further discussion. So we can go to the next slide. I just want to quickly touch base on the development incentive questions, because so much of discussing APFO also talks about how to incentivize more affordable housing. So while we might want to recommend changes to APFO, we also have to look at how do we incentivize people actually building affordable housing and how can that work in concert. The general plan and a lot of prior work that was done through many different planning studies for decades now has looked at different tools. And one of the ones that's really been considering is that zoning overlay. That's one of the reasons we talked so much earlier in this meeting about the distribution of housing and the types of housing and whether it's affordable or not, is because we need to understand if we're going to do an overlay. And if this group says, yes, that's a great tool to use, we also have to decide where do we put it and what will the overlay encourage, what kind of housing and at what level of affordability. So we wanted to tell you that that is one of the tools that's been contemplated in our general plan. Other tools are looking at that set aside, and should that set aside in the allocation chart be used for density bonuses? And how do we balance density bonuses associated with market rate units, with affordable housing units. What's the right industry number that can actually encourage people to develop affordable housing? What makes sense? What's realistic for developers? What actually provides that level of affordability we want? How do you set up a successful density bonus system? Your experiences with other communities. Should there be other incentives, such as trying to bring in affordable housing projects into more of an administrative review process? That's to try to streamline the review process. So these are some of the things that have been contemplated. If you can go to the next slide. And I don't want to assume that everyone knows what I'm talking about when I say an overlay. So I just want to do a quick overview of, there's two types. So there's basic zoning, which is essentially, this is what you're allowed to build in a certain geographic area. This is the number of units you can build per acre. This is the setbacks and heights and bulk regulations you have to adhere to. Then we have floating zones. Floating zones are essentially a type of development that you may do on a certain existing base zoning district, but you have to go through a process to basically pull it down from the cloud, propose a specific development project, and have that development project be approved. That goes to the county council, so the zoning board, for their approval of that. So it's a process that happens after the fact. And then an overlay zone is essentially a separate zoning district that sits on top of your base zoning district. So this is, and it can be either more permissive or more restrictive. So one of the best ways to understand this is to think about historic districts, where you might say, I have a historic district, I'm going to allow commercial uses, residential uses, specialty industry uses, but all of those uses need to go through a special criteria or additional review process because it's in a historic district and there's these additional controls. Or you can be more permissive and you can say, this is your base zoning district, but we're going to put an overlay and we're going to give you a bonus and a streamlined process. And we're going to give you some additional alternative development programs that you have an option to utilize if you want to utilize it. So it's a good tool for kind of trying to specialize what we're allowing in the county or control for more nuance on the ground. So that's just a very quick 101 of floating versus overlay. Next slide, please. And then I'd also say, there's been many planning studies that fed into really what brought us all here together to discuss how do we actually implement the many tools that have been discussed and contemplated. So I want to just remind you of what the Housing Opportunities Master Plan said. It wanted us to identify neighborhoods where we don't have enough low and moderate income housing, to talk about the different incentives that we can do to encourage the production of affordable housing, how we can allow affordable housing to meet specific criteria, and whether that should be by right so that it can have a more streamlined process or administrative review of those processes. And then we also want to expand the different kinds of housing opportunities throughout the county. You think back to the first half of our meeting today when we talked about the fact that we're pretty limited in the supply of certain housing types in the rural West. How can we expand those housing opportunities given all the different policies and regulations that shape where and how you build? And then we have other things in terms of how to increase affordable housing opportunities throughout Howard County, thinking through our racial and socioeconomic integration as well. Next slide, please. So HOCO by Design, which is the general plan, it recommends developing those development incentives. We talked about density bonuses. We talked about potentially offering relief to setback and other development standards. As we know, you can say we allow for a range of housing types in a particular district, but then if your height and your bulk regulations and your setbacks and your colors and your landscaping are all designed to make that cost prohibited or physically incapable of fitting that on the lot size, then you're not actually encouraging that housing production. So what kind of relief is needed to actually get what we want to be built, where we want it to be built at the right price point? And then should we be expanding our list of exemptions for certain affordable housing units? Jeff talked about the exemptions that currently exist, and you can see the track record of past tweaks that have been made to APFO in an effort to try to address this issue, and we're continuing that process. talking about the rollover from year to year. And if there's other regulatory barriers that you guys are aware of in your work that are really creating those barriers to actually production of affordable housing. Go to the next slide, please. So this is a rehash a little bit of what we talked about. Talked to you guys a little bit about missing middle and what that meant. Talked about the bulk regulations, a little bit reiterating what we've already talked about, the need for flexibility for adult group homes, communal living, accessible modifications for older adults. That's some of what we talked about last meeting as well. Looking at the looking at the age-restricted adult housing zoning regulations and the density requirements associated with that. That was touched on less at our last meeting, and it's also something we want to discuss, as well as a lot of times we know that it's hard to get funding for these projects, that most lenders don't want to fund speculative projects. They want to see successful on the ground proof that this can, return on investment for them. And so what do nonprofits need to do? What do developers need to do? What kind of partnerships can be set up with government so that we can actually do these pilot projects and demonstrate that these can be successful and tweak that out so that the market has an incentive to actually fund them. So if we can go to the next slide. So we've reached the long-awaited, you guys have been incredibly patient for an hour and a half of digging in for discussions. I know that many of you have probably gone glaze-eyed on us at this point, so we all need to take a break before we dive into sections. We can take a quick minute. We also have some prompting questions. I want to open the floor. You guys can discuss anything that's been raised. You guys have been great at participating throughout the presentation, but we did have some prompting questions in case anyone needs something to respond to. So if you can go to the next slide, I'm going to open the floor and for you guys for the remainder of the meeting.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. I haven't been able to get a words in edgewise for an hour and a half. And I know you were saying the whole questions to the end. So I don't know if like future meetings, like if someone can monitor, like if we're raising our hand, or leave more time for questions. But anyway, I kind of want to go back to the beginning. And I'll just ask my two questions and you guys could just chime in. I wanted to go to the middle home types. I just was curious, have any thought been considered into looking into manufactured homes? Because those are different from mobile homes, and just kind of curious of what the thought is of that around the room. I know I've been in conversations and toured some home sites where manufactured homes were built, and I think the attorney on one of the calls, for lack of a better professional word, said that Howard County would flip their top if this was manufactured homes was ever allowed to be zoned in the county. So just curious about that. And then the second question I had was, when this comes to the western part of the county, I get like infrastructure, I get that it needs to be infrastructure there, but when I hear, only 1 or 2 homes has been built, I'm just curious to know, like, has anyone looked at like what is the cost to build there, and like pretty much like what's the holdup, for lack of better words, because eventually we're going to run out of places to dig in Columbia. So at some point we need to start looking elsewhere.
I'll open the floor, but I will say for manufactured home is we in Howard County, we do mobile home and manufactured home have the same meaning in our zoning code. And we do currently prohibit it in most of our zoning districts. I think it's only allowed in our RMH zone. There was a recently adopted state legislation that preempts local zoning code, so that if you have a zoning district that allows a single family home, you must allow manufactured or modular housing. So that becomes effective in January. So as of January, wherever we allow single family homes, we must also allow manufactured homes or mobile homes as well as modular homes, subject to a few conditions. They essentially have to be turned into real property to qualify for that. So that's one answer to the question. Although I'm not preempting your discussion of our local zoning, and if there are local changes that want to be made to that. And then just to answer your question, and clarify, there's been more than 1 or 2 homes built in Western. It's just that that's the exemption for, the APFO test is, if you're only building a single lot. And the barriers to development in the West are multifold, but one of them is water sewer. The other one has been the policy of preserving agricultural land. So there's a lot of agricultural preservation easements where the county purchased the development rights on that property so that it could be remain in the agricultural industry realm. So that's some of the restrictions that go into it. And then the rest of it has been, there have been some state rules and tiers for limiting development that do not allow the county to develop at a higher density in certain areas. And so there's some state laws and policies that go into some of the task zoning decisions. That's kind of its own feedback, but I just wanted to answer specific questions. And then if anyone else in the group has a response, those great prompts.
Market as a whole is not that interested in the West any longer. Maybe 50 homes a year now. I'm not sure I understand why, but it seems like big house on huge lot isn't as attractive as it used to be.
Because of cost. A 3-acre lot's going for over 400,000. You're 400,000 in on the lot, then you got to build the house. That's why it's not as attractive. That's the reason. It's you're over $1 million. And then, so that's the reason. We're seeing building in the West, but not of any amount, significant amount.
Yeah, I would just argue that like we're building $1 million homes in Columbia. Like we're not even building, like the homes that are being built are not even starter homes for the average person. Like the starter homes in Howard County that are being built are starting at like $750 and upwards.
Yes.
So it's still $1 million. I mean, but I hear what you're saying. I just was, and I kind of already know the answer. I just wanted to just say that like on the recording, like, just kind of get other folks' perspectives that's actually out here doing the work and doing the building, kind of like what they see, what the problem is. But it's $1 million townhomes in Columbia. So.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. And Maple Lawn, Columbia, Ellicott City, absolutely. One of the ones I just wanted to bring up just for conversation is the community right here near the George Howard Building is Ellicott Crossing. It was required due to the nature of the community and historic Ellicott City required all the townhomes to be brick. That was very cost prohibitive for the developer to provide MIGs. They did. We have 15 MIGs in that community, but a requirement of an all brick townhome and then telling a developer they have to provide 10% of the units as MIGs is really cost prohibitive too. Brick is very expensive and that was required. And I think they're not in the historic district, but in terms of the character of the community.
So who requires? You mean planning?
Someone in Howard County, I guess planning, I guess, I don't know. I don't know who, I assume planning and zoning based on something, but.
There are special requirements in historic districts.
It's not a historic district though.
It's outside of the actual district.
I think it's outside.
We can look into what the requirement is.
Yes, I just recall that they had to all be brick. And I love it because then the MIGs are indistinguishable from the outside. I love that. But it is really, really expensive to do brick.
It wasn't an HOA sort of thing?
No,
Okay.
not to my
Yeah,
knowledge.
okay, yeah.
Get the name of the developer.
Huh? What's it called? Ellicott Crossing, right here.
Oh, that's
Right. When you come left before the drugstore.
Oh,
Right there.
Oh, I know that one.
I got it. Yeah, okay.
Right there.
So I'm gonna summarize that as a discussion about the form and design of housing and the kind of
Well,
broad.
it's housing, period.
Okay.
It's housing, it's not affordable housing, it's just housing.
I think that's was probably.
I was supposed to be lobbing a ball.
Because it's regional.
Well, I think it's all,
It was.
never finding a gap in the conversation I wouldn't like to fill. I'll jump in that I think what you're maybe prompting is that, we're talking somewhat about affordable housing, but I think a lot of these go to housing generally.
Mhm.
we clearly are limiting supply of housing and therefore prices go up. It's not a complicated or particularly new formula. And while we can say that it's not limited through allocations, I think what we're seeing is limits through school tests in APFO. We're seeing limits through zoning. Because even if we wanted to build in the west, why not take a 3-acre lot and allow 10 houses on it? That's not a water and sewer issue. It's no longer a septic system issue. We're not studying it from a septic system point of view. We're just studying it from point of view of what do we want to do with these areas. And while we call a lot of that rural, I don't think, large house on 3 acres is rural. It's expensive suburban. It's not agricultural land. It's grass. It's whatever else is out there on a large lot. And we're not willing to take that on. And I think the other place we limit things is even when we can add density, we choose not to through discretionary decisions. So the Hickory Ridge Village Center, which wanted to do apartments, was out of character with single family. So even though it's a village center, we can't build there. So I think if we're going to go to the discussion of overlay districts, and this is where I know it'll become politically very difficult. I don't mean to say this is something that is going to be easy to get approved. It needs to be by right. So we need to say these are where we're going to build, and then it can't be a political discussion. There's all sorts of data showing that when you make it a political decision by a politically elected body, the people who show up are predominantly richer and predominantly older and predominantly whiter, and they predominantly oppose more housing. And it's not representative of the electorate at large or the demand, certainly, because the demand is there. We have a demand now for over 9,000 units for people who already live here at 60% of median or less. They live here, they're paying too much for rent, they're underhoused, or they're homeless, or they're doubled up, and they're here today. So to say that because we don't have allocations limiting it doesn't mean we're not limiting it, we're just doing it in other ways. And I think the primary way is we have very little land for multifamily housing or townhouses, et cetera. And HOCO by design changed that in a very limited way. If you look at where we can build those units, it's still in an extremely small segment of the county. You can look at race and how it dovetails with where we allow that type of housing. And you can see we have segregated the county intentionally through those zoning practices. And I think we need to change that. And if we're going to go look at overlay districts, they really need to be by right, or we're going to have the same types of decisions continuing to be made. And I realize, like I said, that's going to be I realize that's the very difficult part.
The by right part is critical. You're 100% right about that. One thing I would add to that is that in order to reduce the fears, some of the fears, maybe some of the reasonable fears, pattern book idea, I think would be a smart way to introduce that so that overlay has a pattern. It shows you in advance what the front of the house could look like. You have to be careful with the pattern book because, as you said, some choices are more expensive and more difficult to do as affordable housing. But with a pattern book, it takes some of the edge off the sky falling problem. We have the right to do it by right, but we're going to be mindful of who our neighbors are. It will look like one of these 10, 12 different kinds of products that could go there. And then I think if you're a sensitive developer at all, you work it out with the community. Listen to the closest neighbor with the most legitimate real world concerns and deal with it. So maybe you don't get 25 units to the acre, maybe you don't get 20, because on one side there's a valid concern about something. But it's a matter of right, by right. Work to make the rest of it compatible, or as compatible as can be with the neighborhood.
Anyone online want to contribute to this discussion or throw out another discussion item?
Well, I'll just talk about last, I'll keep talking.
Well, let me just pause.
So
Anyone?
Can you hear me? This is Cedric.
Yeah,
Can
we
you
can
hear me?
hear you. Yeah, we
Oh,
can hear you.
okay. Yeah, I kind of wanted to double down on what Peter was mentioning. If we can go in and advocate for, push for, making adjustments, modifications to the zoning and pushing for by right development, whether it's overlay or not, but having certain areas where we know that we are allowed and can do development by right. That's gonna just it's going to take away some of the ability of people to push back on any development, delaying, development, making it just take longer to occur. So I think what we need to do is just push for the ability to do development by right and know that it will be, there's going to be some pushback to that, but we should just brace ourselves and be prepared to go in for that battle and, just try and try and try to get development by right.
Cedric, I have a question for you.
Sure.
A lot of the projects that have been raised, I think some of them were by right development, but they had discretionarily reviews by other bodies. So I just want to see, does this group have a distinction between the reuse itself and what they want to build being by right versus the process by which that development is reviewed? Because I think there is a distinction between those, and I want to make sure I'm kind of teasing out your guys' recommendations.
What are discretionary, what are discretionary reviews if it's by right?
So,
Right.
sorry, I don't want to cut him off. I was thinking more in terms of, so you could say, I'm bringing up the Hickory Ridge case where, you have the right to build.
No, you need the county approval, that's not by right.
But you have the ability to seek the use.
By right means you don't get a body coming and saying you can't do it. If it's zoned for it, you can do it.
Right.
The regulatory process for reviewing what you're proposing is going through the zoning board, but you're still allowed to do that use, like the district allows.
Not if it's by right.
Not by zoning.
That's not what by right means.
Sorry, Jeff?
Well, I think in your case, it was needed zoning permission to build Hickory Ridge, and it was rejected by the
Right.
council.
Oh, yeah. 'Cause
That's what.
I do think, though, that there are other,
'cause
discretionary, but there are other administrative barriers that can. Like, for instance, one of the things that I thought that an overlay district with its pattern book that might help the community accept it is to have the DAP do a review of the proposed architecture. But that can be time consuming. Perhaps you can find that with the SDP review. So DAP plays some sort of an advisory role on the elevations of the product to be built and a review of the pattern book when the by right developer moves ahead with the project. They've got some confidence that they can build it because it's in conformance with zoning regulations and pattern book and with the DEP guidance.
Hey, this is Justin Kennel with Bizzuto. Speaking of design guidelines, I thought I'd shed some light on experience that I had down in Chevy Chase in Montgomery County. I've spent some time down there working on a project called Chevy Chase Lake, and there's been some considerable change in the past, I'd say 10 years, as a result of a sector plan process that the planning department kind of commissioned for the area. And that really set the tone in terms of what the zoning and land usage should be around that area. Given it was kind of spurred by the Purple Line, but still really served as a catalyst to add different housing types and density to an area that traditionally has been single family neighborhoods and I would say not dilapidated shopping centers, but single story shopping centers. But now there's moderately priced dwelling units, market rate apartments, for sale townhouses. And I just thought that the sector plan was really powerful, but also successful in that sense. And it came with design guidelines. So one of the buildings that we designed, we had to adhere to designing the apartments like short roses of townhouses, but they're not exactly townhouses. They backed up to single family neighborhoods. So I say that because not knowing specifically if the county has many, if any at all, like focused sector plan like areas that could fall under this discussion. And I'll also say, just while I'm speaking, just on behalf of Bozzuto, we've been, I think we've had like 5 or 6 projects in Montgomery County in the past 6 to 8 years, but 0 in Howard County. I don't think that's from some of these process-oriented hurdles, such as APF. I think it's mostly strictly the limited land opportunities for multifamily housing in the county, most of which is probably in Columbia. There just doesn't seem to be that many opportunities. Again, I'm kind of painting a broad brush here, but thought I'd give my 2 cents here.
Okay, we're looking at about 7 minutes left. I think we can kind of wrap up today's discussion. Lisa, if you can advance to the next meeting topic slide. 55. So we'll be meeting on November 4th, and we're going to continue today's discussion. We're not going to have the bevy of presentations that came at you guys today. So just want to think on this. We'll send out these meeting slides. This will also be the prompting questions. And the one thing we are going to be adding to that conversation is discussing not just about rental opportunities, overall housing opportunities, but the council was particularly interested in looking at homeownership opportunities and how the set aside could be utilized for that. So we're going to continue our conversation about how to better geographically target areas for affordable housing. And then the only thing I'll say on the next slide is we have been taking notes for any requested items you have for today. If there's any other research items we can provide or questions that come up, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, we will look forward to seeing everyone on November 4th. We do have a little bit more time if there's any other discussion prompts that anyone wants to raise today. I know it's hard to unmute yourself one more.
This is Cedric one final time, and the example that was given earlier, I believe there were 3 communities that were allowed to be built with the school exemption through the AP, or to be exempted from the school portion of the APFO. Just curious whether the count at those schools, whether there were any overcrowding issues, or just wanted to know, since it did not go through that process, have those communities, I hate to use the word, but have they presented any kind of burden to the count, the overall count for schools in that area?
So I'll just clarify, they do still have to go through the process to determine and have the council agree to allow them to have an exemption, but the count still happens and they still are subject. But I will tell you that only the first one, Legacy at Twin Rivers, has just reopened this year. The other 2 are pending. So only one has reopened, and we don't know yet the full impact on the schools, because I think they just opened in July or August. So we don't know yet.
Okay.
What the impact is.
And thank you for the answer. I'd just be curious how we can track, and I think it'll be an excellent thing to present. Assuming there is no negative impact, it's something that could work to our advantage, and we could use it as a tool in the future.
Right, Jeff wanted to add something.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. It's something we could definitely track. So as these get built and we have a few years of history, the school system could come up with numbers and impacts and things. So that's a good thing. I did want to mention that you reminded me. The one unique thing about those 3 projects is that they were all redevelopment projects.
Right.
So they weren't brand new apartments on vacant land. They were older
Right.
apartments that were redeveloped with not only were they redeveloped, but they added additional units, so density increase. Yeah,
I mean,
Well, Patuxent Commons is new.
except Patuxent Commons.
Right.
Yeah, that too, I'm sorry. Right.
Right.
Yeah, right.
So it'll be interesting to
And-
see
and also-
if a new community really adds to the schools, or if the existing community kind of bring back more kids, add more kids, or just bring back the kids who were there.
Right.
Go ahead, Ned.
Yeah, I was gonna say too, that additional density predominantly with smaller units. So just another fact to put in. And I really don't know what mechanism is in place to track whether there's an increase or a decrease in school usage by those communities. Is there anything in place, or is that going to be some other mechanism that we're going to figure out how to do that by either the school system or having us do individual polls, or I'm not sure. How is that even going to go?
Well, there's no mechanism in terms of the legislation of these types of things. There's no requirement to track it, but we can easily track it. So we just need to ask the question, and we could collect the information over time to come up with the answer, which would be a good thing to be able to see how it impacts our future projects.
the state has a publication on schools and housing where, and I don't know what their backing is for this, where they basically say there is not a connection.
Mhm.
But I don't know, that might vary locally, or again, I don't know the data source for that. I would ask the group, in particular developers on the group, and this is somewhat me, but I think one of the things that is going to be necessary if we're really going to make a change, I think, because Tanika was pointing out that a lot of the county, or Jessica, you said this too, or Jeff, somebody that we're built out a lot. Right now, it doesn't seem cost efficient to take a lot of our old garden apartments and convert them to more dense projects. So what would it take to get there? And I don't know if that's just increasing rents, or subsidy on the costs, or both, or easier development and perhaps less, fewer fees attached to developing period. But I think that's one place where there's a real opportunity, because that is so much of our housing stock now. And unless we really change, even if we change single family zoning to something else, it's difficult to buy up the single family lots, collect them in a way to get something that would be a collection that could be developed. So I think that may be one area where we could try to do something. But honestly, we've looked at some of our stuff, and I don't know how to make it economically viable yet. So developers, if you have any ideas, that would be something.
I think that's part of, it's going beyond density. What you're talking about there is parking requirements, setbacks, those things that it's how to more efficiently use the available land, because those are also factors in it. So even if you increase density, if you can't build, it doesn't matter.
Right.
And if you can't park people, because let's be clear, we are a suburban community, people have cars. So, yeah.
Well, I can also tell you a major hurdle of that is, especially with an affordable housing development that takes on all the subsidy and sources that we have, is the relocation issues that come into play, but even with increased density and rescraping it, it is a monumental task that costs a lot of money to deal with.
Mhm.
Well, if my computer's any indication, because it just died, it's 5 o'clock, power has left.
Computer signed off. 5 o'clock, I'm done.
Yeah.
So thank you all for attending this. I know it was a lengthy meeting for presentations and look forward to discussing further with you guys. We'll send up the follow-up meeting summaries and don't hesitate to reach out with any recommendations for how to improve these meetings to help facilitate these sessions. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
That's the presentation.